So I was thinking about what to talk about, and some of my doctoral research is looking at research into dreams using Jungian symbolism. I was thinking about this conference and about how very much dreams are like films, in that they merge the physical, the psychological, the spiritual in a world that takes us somewhere different. And so where I ended up was Star Wars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you into a galaxy far, far away. It's not a long time ago. So I'm talking about the Star Wars trilogy, and I'm keeping canonical here. So the first three, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and The Return of the Jedi. And Lucas called this, in an interview, an old myth in a new way. He was concerned with the notions of good against evil, life against death, man against machine. And we know that through what he said, he was influenced by Kurosawa, The Hidden Fortress, the 1930s series on Flash Gordon, and Campbell, who wrote the monomyth, The Hero's Journey. And at its most basic, the trilogy is a morality play. It's an artistic experience that shares elements with both myths and fairy tales. It even starts as a fairy tale would, once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away. Remember that from when you were a child. At the beginning of the first screenings, there was a 3-minute standing ovation for the film. And we know that at least 2 of this trilogy are in the top 20 films of all time, as voted both by critics and filmgoers alike. Star Wars, one of the Star Wars films, received 6 Oscars. So Lucas says it's an old myth in a new way. And he also says it's the meat and potatoes of your society to the next generation. He was very aware of the fact that he was myth-making. And in his interview with Bill Moyers, he states that he consciously set about to recreate myths, to deal with current life issues. Bettelheim talks about the unconscious appeal of traditional fairy tales, about how it gives meaning to life. And Star Wars shares this in that it shows us that the meaning of a life with machines can also be optimistic, where myths tend to be more pessimistic in tone. There's something of the déjà vu about this film, the feeling of familiar psychic ground, and it's this that I want to explore. So a Jungian interpretation, which I propose, steps beyond the monomyth. And it talks about the definition of a modern myth. And it sees Star Wars as a journey of individuation, with movies as a symbolic narrative. So although Lucas admitted that Campbell was his mentor, I want to remind you that there were 2 drafts of Star Wars, the first Star Wars, that had already been written by the time that Lucas found the hero with 1,000 faces. And that suggests to me that my proposal that actually this digs a little bit deeper than Campbell is valid. The speed with which Campbell's mythological principles were taken into Hollywood also speaks to me of the fact that he was tapping into an unconscious and contagious fascination that these films held, and that these tie to archaic archetypes. Jung said, every attempt at psychological explanation is, at bottom, the creation of a new myth. And what I'm looking at here is a myth as a way of making sense of the physical world, a myth as a sacred narrative which is usually used to explain how the world or humankind came to be in its present form. What's so interesting about Star Wars is that each character represents more than one archetype. And so what I've done is I've gone through each of those major characters and identified some of the archetypes that they represent. But let's remind ourselves about Jungian archetypes. What are they? Jung stated that he based his archetypes on St. Augustine's Platonic forms, so they're not out of place in a philosophical conference. They're timeless in the same way that the forms were for Plato, and we know that they are non-material. As with Plato, Spinoza, Hegel, Schopenhauer, they sit outside causal laws. They have an inherent tendency to look at the way that we experience the world, and archetypes are an inborn mode of psychic behaviour. They are structures that give form. They teach us how to behave. They are about the laws of psychic functioning, and they give life patterns, just as Proust's Petit Madeleine is a form of emotion and boyhood as well as a taste. So archetypes are not the whole of the thing that they reach for, but they inhere within them. The Kantian model is that we can only know the world as we see it, not how it actually is. And the archetypes speak to this. I'm giving you a selection of some of the major characters, given our time constrictions, and further analysis would demonstrate the crossover that exists between some of them. Because the language of archetypes is symbolic, it makes them perfect for films. Underlying everything, there is the force. I hope this is going to work. Maybe not. Okay. Don't worry. So, the force I see as the collective unconscious. It's a mystery. It's about instincts, impulses, hunches, and beliefs. It's about entandiodromia, which comes from Heraclitus. We're talking here about cold things becoming warm, warm things becoming cool, wet things becoming dry, and parched things becoming wet, all around in a circle again. Plato described the Ouroboros as the first living thing, a self-eating circular being, the universe as an immortal, mythological, constructed entity. And here I point you towards the east. Think about the yin and yang of Taoism. Jung takes Heraclitus and says eventually everything turns into its opposite. And in the Star Wars trilogy, rebels and imperial forces are together, light and dark is together, Luke and Darth Vader are together. Even in more modern times, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that." And Star Wars is a beautiful example of that. So the force is panpsychism. We look at Plato and Spinoza, it's life-affirming. It speaks to the logos of the Stoics and major shifts in worldview. And I ask you to consider the time of creation, the mode of creation of the Star Wars trilogy, when the Vietnam War had just finished. We're talking here to rebels and a larger force. Think about America, think about the people that they were fighting. The collective unconscious is a non-personalized source of energy. Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism all have that. And it's available in the right circumstances to the right people. It's an expansion of consciousness, learning to relax and trust instinct. In Zen Buddhism, intuition is key. If we think about Star Wars, Luke manages to hit the spot in the Death Star that will destroy it by switching off his conscious mind, by becoming one with the plane that he's flying and concentrating on his intuition of the Force. Spirituality without dogma. The Jedi are spiritual fathers. There's a repetition of 3. And 3 is regarded by Jung as a spiritual number. Much I invite you to consider like Hegelian dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So in that mode, let me take you through some of the archetypes. Here's Luke, the hero. In some ways, the most boring, actually, of all of the characters. He's on a hero's journey. Yeah, okay. He feels compelled to engage on the quest. He is a sky walker. He walks in the sky. He rises above ordinary humanity and achieves something benefiting the whole galaxy. He has an existential dilemma, good and evil, an appeal of the power of evil. He's on a path of Jungian individuation, surrender and acceptance of what he has to do. And at the end of this, there's a spiritual apotheosis. He worships the psychic force active within him as something divine. Jung says the hero's main feat is to overcome the monster of darkness. It is the long hoped for and expected triumph of consciousness over the unconscious. And ultimately, he achieves rebirth through transformation. And the archetypal hero has traits that are shared with other heroes, such as Beowulf or Sir Lancelot. He has unusual birth circumstances. His mother died. He leaves his family to live with his aunt and uncle. He has traumatic life events that lead to his quest. His aunt and uncle are killed. And he has a special lightsaber, his special weapon. He has supernatural help from Obi-Wan Kenobi. He proves himself when he blows up the Death Star. He has a journey and an unhealable wound. He takes Jung's night sea journey. Think here about Plato's cave. Jung calls it disorientating. And he lets himself plunge into its depths in order to find himself. This is Nekia, a trip to the underworld. It leads him to know that his destiny is the fight with Vader on the Death Star. He does fight with Vader, and he loses his hand, and he makes a flesh sacrifice. And then in the next stage of his hero's journey, he has atonement with his father. He redeems his evil deeds, he reconciles his father and forgives him, and the father becomes Anakin again in The Return of the Jedi. And the spiritual apotheosis for Luke is that he meets and joins the Jedi Knights. Let's move on. Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan is the helper, essentially, the archetype of the helper. He's the space father. He fights for truth and justice. He follows martial arts-like philosophy. He wears the robes. He inculcates training, and he has a respect for the Force. And I point you here towards Kurosawa as the catalyst for this. He introduces Luke to the potential for evil in the Force. He teaches Luke the way of the Jedi Knight. Just as Plato's Republic, the Guardians have virtues of goodness and justice and action, which are right only if the virtuous use them. And his manner of teaching is Zen-like, to gain insight without mind. He offers Luke his talisman, the lightsaber, as if he's giving him a magical sword, a sword of inheritance. And when he fights Vader, and he disappears, only his robes are left. He dematerializes into another dimension, as a martyr would. Other archetypes that he typifies are the space father and the mentor. And this is the form of religious expression. He's transmuted into another realm. Think about Jesus' resurrection. The link between Lucas and Kurosawa is clear about samurai warriors and their code of conduct. And the sword that he offers is laden with symbolism. But let's get on to the really exciting characters. Yoda, who is the wise old man, the archetype of the sage. He's the magician. He enhances consciousness. Fairy stories are rich and laden with the wise old man. When we first meet him, we think he's insignificant. Luke doesn't know who he is, and he wants to go and find the real person he has to talk to. Yoda typifies Stoic values. He's trying to achieve timeliness, patience, a focus on the present, living in agreement with nature without suffering, And he has a deep commitment, and he's clear about a serious mind. Remember, he says to Obi-Wan, I don't want to train this one. He hasn't got a serious enough mind. But what's really interesting, I thought, when I started researching this, is that Yoda is Sanskrit for warrior. He's a spiritual guide. He creates a sacred space, offers initiation, and ultimately transformation. He also proposes a positive image of the emperor. The magician is a Socratic figure. He has numinous energy that is powerful and teaches the apprentice in a way that leads to change. He takes the acolyte through initiation, is carried on his back, and whilst he goes through the swamp, Luke learns his quest. Yoda lacks fear, aggression, and hatred. He's neither tempered by bodily pleasures, and he is committed to the light side of the Force. The difference is that, as with the Stoics, Yoda sees compassion as a virtue, whereas the Emperor sees it as a weakness. The Emperor says it will lead to Luke's undoing. Yoda is a symbol of universal truth. Darth Vader. Ooh. Darth Vader is the classic Jungian shadow. He's a dark adversary. He has dark thoughts. He is the most despised parts of self, of Luke's self, and of ourselves. Jung points to Iago in Othello, Satan in Paradise Lost, and Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. And in Star Wars, the shadow is Darth Vader. The shadow is the numinous without the containment. And this is what ultimately destroys you. Communal spiritual practice is regarded as a necessary part of spiritual practice that leads to transformation. Without a helper, you think you're the magician, but you're not. And that's the trap that Vader is lost in. He's also part of the royal marriage. For Jung, the royal marriage is a necessary combination of light and dark, of the unconscious and the conscious. And this is the part that he plays with Luke. For Jung, individuation is not possible without an encounter with the unconscious. In other words, Luke cannot become himself without meeting Vader. Jung says that consciousness can only exist through continual recognition of the unconscious. Han Solo. I think he's the trickster. He's the negative. He's the anti-hero. He's a prankster, a rogue. When we first meet him, a shapeshifter. He's exposed to torture, but he's also ultimately a saviour. He's a bad boy, a con man. In American Indian mythology, he's the great hare, the coyote, the raven. He's smart. And Jung says that the trickster manages to achieve through his stupidity what others fail to accomplish with their best efforts. And this is exactly what Han Solo does. But he's also transformed from an arrogant egoist to a moral leader. And that's through the relationships that this archetype has with the others. For him, the torture in carbonite is a doorway to a new way of life. I'm going to stop there. There are lots more characters. I've got lots more. I can show you them later.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Thank you.
If you want to conclude in few sentences, I mean, I think we would all be able to, yeah.
Well, I'll do Leia because I think she's the most interesting. Let's have a woman.
Yeah.
So Leia is on first blush the most boring character. She's the damsel in distress. She's the woman in the bikini that's there for all the dads, you know. not very exciting. But actually, she's much more complicated than that. She's the most ambiguous character, and she's much more than a helpless, passive maiden. She's angelic opposite Vader. Think about the white robes that she wears. And she's tiny, he's huge. She's a force for moral good, and he's darkness. But she is also a sky walker. And she also has access, as we know, to the Force. She's Luke's soulmate, and this is what makes her the archetype of the anima, the feminine, for Luke. She is the inner woman. She's part of this royal pair, brother and sister, masculine and feminine, and she actually has her own hero's quest. She rescues Han from Jabba, and she plays an enormous part in the rebellion. And at the end of the trilogy, it's Leia who's the one who's really the driving force. She's also the goddess, the queen, and she's hard. She resists the mind probe. She doesn't cry when her planet's destroyed. She leads the rebel forces. She's connected to the knight, Han Solo, and the hero, Luke. She's a mixture of purity and sensuality, and I point you back to that bikini. She's the projection of whatever the male fantasy of an ideal woman might be. And it's pointed out that she's also one of the ultimate Jungian archetypes, the anima. She works behind the scenes in The Return of the Jedi, just as the inner feminine works within a man. Okay.